Welcome to the Concepts from the Global South podcast. Here we explore the connections between the past and present of non-European societies with the help of antique, classical, modern, amic, and ethic concepts. My name is Alisa Shablovskaia, and I'm postdoctoral fellow in Iranian studies at the University of Oslo.
Hello, everyone. This is Alp Eren Topal, and I'm an assistant professor of history at Haldun University, Istanbul. And today we have Marie Elston with us to talk about the Arabic concept of manhaj in contemporary Egypt. Mary has been working on contemporary Islamic education in Egypt, and he's going to talk about manhaj in relation to education, politics, and tradition in Egypt. Mary, could you briefly introduce yourself, what you have been doing, and tell us a bit about your work and how do you come to work on this?
Thank you so much, Alisa and Alp, for inviting me this morning to talk a little bit about my work and this very fascinating concept, manhaj. I came to this concept, manhaj, during my dissertation research in Egypt, where I did ethnographic fieldwork and also textual historical work at al-Azhar. So for those who don't know, al-Azhar is a mosque madrasa that was founded in the 10th century under the Fatimid Empire in Cairo. In the 20th century, it essentially became a semi-autonomous aspect of the Egyptian state, one of the highest religious authority, the highest Muslim religious authority in Egypt, and one of the highest in the Sunni Muslim world. Al-Azhar today is also a K-12 education system and a vast university system in Egypt with campuses dispersed throughout the country. My research focused specifically on the revival of study circles or halaqat in Al-Azhar Mosque in the late 1990s by a coterie of high-up Muslim religious scholars, who I will also refer today as ulama. So people like the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, Ali Goma, and also the current Minister of Endowments, Usama al-Azhari. So in the discourses and statements and practices of these scholars and their students, the term manhaj, and specifically the Azhar manhaj, figures very prominently. I thought I could begin, Alp and Alisa, if this sounds good to you, with a little bit of background about manhaj as a concept, and then I can go into some of the details about the Azhar manhaj.
That would be great. So what is manhaj?
Yeah, so what is manhaj? So this concept manhaj, which is also sometimes expressed as minhaj, that's more common in, I think, pre-modern Arabic texts, comes from the Arabic root nahaja. In medieval Arabic dictionaries, manhaj tends to be defined as a manifest, plainly apparent, open road or way. It figures in the Quran, in Surat al-Ma'idah, where it says, and I won't read the Arabic, but a rough translation, to each of you we prescribed a law and a clear way, minhaj. Minhaj also appears in medieval texts of Islamic jurisprudence. For instance, it is in the title, Minhaj al-Talibin, the 13th century text in Shafi'i jurisprudence by Imam an-Nawawi, where based on earlier texts of Islamic Shafi'i jurisprudence, he sort of delineates the clear path of seekers of knowledge according to the Shafi'i school, some of sort of the basic tenets of Shafi'i jurisprudence. Yet, in the 20th century, manhaj took on a new meaning and political life. Semantically, this term expanded to become something that in English we could render method or methodology. That's sort of those are the most common translations. Most likely, this took place through the influence of translation and the influence of European languages in the Arab world in the early 20th century. In this semantic expansion, manhaj became entangled with particular sets of politics, particularly those pertaining to colonialism and post-colonial modernity. So, as a little bit more background, in the late 19th century, sort of this moment where European colonialism and imperialism was, very apparent and entrenched in the Arab Muslim world, there began to be a sense amongst a diverse range of thinkers, so people who took sort of more interested in Arab nationalism or Islamic reform, so different kinds of political projects and backgrounds, but a common interest in turning to a more distant path, an earlier time in Arab Islamic intellectual history to sort of rediscover an authentic heritage, if you will. So Ahmad Ashamsi has described this in his fantastic book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, how many of these scholars and thinkers sort of sought manuscripts from these earlier centuries of Islam and edited them and published them to bring to contemporary consciousness, whether Arab or Muslim, these texts and sort of the different kinds of outlook and possibilities that they made possible. So this past at some point, and most likely in the interwar period in the Arab world, came to be rendered through this concept of Turath. So I've spoken about Turath elsewhere in a different podcast, the Religion and Politics podcast that is through ECOS, this department at the University of Oslo as well. So Turath today is a ubiquitous concept in Arab discourses, including at al-Azhar. It is also a contested concept where there's sort of different ideologies and politics and subjectivities sort of all sort of vying for definitions of Turath. Yasmin Daifallah, this fantastic historian of political thought, describes Turath as quintessentially a political concept mobilized as an authentic resource through which Arabs or Muslims can define an indigenous way of being against colonial modernity. So a resource, if you will, through which Arabs or Muslims, whatever sort of the relevant identity is, can sort of seek an authentic way of being, a resource for this authentic way of being against westernized or colonial modernity.
So basically, Turath is a kind of comprehensive concept of tradition, referring to a large corpus of thinking and writing. And MANHAJ is like a path to that?
Yeah, thank you. So alongside Turath, and part of a similar set of political concerns came an engagement with this question of manhaj or methodology. So on the one hand, there's this heritage or tradition, this vast corpus of texts and way of seeing and sort of paradigm of knowing that we could say is contained in the concept Turath. But then there's this question of, well, how do we interpret it? How do we engage it? What methodology should we follow? This question posed a dilemma for thinkers in the 20th century. By adopting historicist or empiricist methodologies, for instance, were Arab Muslims merely reinscribing Western epistemological universalism? This was a concern that people had. So was there a way to extract indigenous methodologies or manahij from the Turath so as to not merely reinforce epistemological submission to the West while still demonstrating their parity with Western methods? So that's sort of very broadly some of the politics that I think emerge in earlier articulations of Turath, and I'll just flag relatively briefly that the historian Angela Giordani has a fantastic dissertation, which I hope will soon be published as a book, where she traces the search for an indigenous manhaj through the Azhari sheikh, briefly the rector of al-Azhar, Mustafa Abdurazik, in his work on Islamic philosophy, specifically where he looked to the sort of usul al-fiqh, so the principles of jurisprudence and early scholars of kalam or theology, in order to extract this kind of sort of interpretive lens that was authentic to the Islamic heritage. And then his student, Ali Sami al-Nashar, did something similar, but in the realm of Islamic logic or Arabic texts in logic, where he had a very clear anti-colonial bent, where he saw the excavation of an indigenous manhaj as essential for the liberation of Arab minds in the mid-20th century. But manhaj also became a key concept in Islamist and Salafi discourses. So, for instance, Said Qutb, the very influential Islamist ideologue, wrote about manhaj both in his earlier work in literary criticism, where I believe he wrote about on Islamic manhaj of literary criticism derived from the Quran. And then in his later work, he talked about Islam itself as a manhaj in the sense of sort of a path for action, for how to make society it's both a praxis, a theory, and a praxis. And this similar kind of action-oriented, comprehensive notion of manhaj also is apparent in Salafi engagements with this concept. So Henri Lauzière has described, and others too, how Mustafa Helmi, this important Salafi thinker in the late 20th century, described Salafism as a manhaj in the sense of a comprehensive way of thinking and a blueprint for action. So all of these earlier engagements with manhaj, I argue in my work, has some bearing on this later 21st century of a concept of the Azhar manhaj, where in their delineation of an Azhar manhaj, they are both responding to and building on, but also against, I think, some of these earlier interpretations of manhaj, where these Azharis are implicitly saying, we also have a manhaj. We also have sort of a method that we can offer to the Muslim community for how to engage with Turath and basically how to live in the contemporary world or the modern world in a way that is congruent with our heritage, tradition, etc.
Well, it was very interesting to learn that it was the Islamist circles who developed this concept of manhaj, but concepts do not belong to certain people. They're in the air, so there is no monopoly on concepts. Of course, the concept of tradition was of ultimate importance for nationalists, for communists, many other political groups. So could you say a couple of words about how Ali Guma, who is the central figure in your research, came and found his own manhaj, found his own path to this concept?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And I really like your representation, Alisa, where you say, like, manhaj is in the air. It's true. It's not owned by anyone. I traced just sort of a piecemeal genealogy of this concept. You could trace it, again, as you just said, like through nationalist and other kinds of discourses. I think, the reason I held up these specific ones in relation to someone like Ali Guma and his students, so I'm actually going to speak more about one of his particular students in just a second, is that, in their articulation of the Azhar manhaj and in basically many aspects of their whole traditionalist project these days, there's a very direct, I think, anti-Salafi and anti-Islamist bent that comes across. And it is apparent as well in the content of the Azhar manhaj as they define it. So people who speak about the Azhar manhaj, one of the most prominent of the ulama who does so is Usama al-Azhari, who is a student of Ali Guma, a former student, but also has risen to prominence and is currently the Minister of Endowments and a very influential, he's also the religious advisor to Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So I think Usama al-Azhari's first publication where he talks about the Azhar manhaj was published in 2011 by the, I think it's the Kalam Media Center, I think it's in Abu Dhabi. So he sort of addresses his manhaj to students of Islamic knowledge, and he says that he has distilled the manhaj as a metin, like as a base text that could theoretically be memorized. And in his delineation of the Azhar manhaj, he describes 8 components, which I will very briefly describe right now. So first, this is an approach to knowledge through a sanad, or the chain of transmission, through an authoritative line of scholars that links the present person all the way to early Islamic times, ideally through practices like mulazama or sohba, so spending time, in-person time with the scholar. Second, this is an approach that emphasizes the importance of the auxiliary sciences, so things like nahu and sarf, grammar and syntax, these aspects of Islamic knowledge that aid in understanding sort of the more central Islamic sciences, if you will, so things like tafsir and fiqh. Third, this is an approach that interprets Islamic law with the objectives, the maqasid of the Sharia in mind. So not taking a literalist approach, but sort of thinking about what are the larger purposes of Sharia. 4, this is an approach that understands the importance of interpreting Quranic verses in context. 5, he says this is an approach that venerates the matter of Muhammad's ummah, right? I think here what he's getting at is this is supposed to be an approach that is inclusive. It's not creating divisions and factionalism in the ummah. Instead, it is one that can contain the whole ummah together. And then in a similar line, number 6, this is an approach that acts as a guide for all of creation. So it's not sort of against parts of the world or other religions. It's an approach that sort of is all-encompassing. Number 7, I'm almost done. There are only 8 of them. This is an approach that recognizes the wholeness of knowledge. So he describes the wholeness of knowledge as referring to 3 facets. The first are the sources of evidence of knowledge. This is the Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', and Qiyas. The second is the hermeneutical approach through which one interprets and analyzes these sources. And third, knowledge is constituted by particular attributes and skills that a person contains in order to be able to correctly, or like in a sahih fashion, interpret this kind of knowledge. And number 8, this is an approach that recognizes the importance of the Turath, right? Very important. So it's not just going back to the Quran and Sunnah and reading them, excluding the later centuries of Islamic scholarly debates and commentaries and interpretations. It's one that takes these into account and takes them very seriously, and indeed is very central to this interpretation of Islamic knowledge.
Thank you, Mary. All of this sounds very hierarchical to me, very authoritarian, the importance of knowledge, of transmission, and religious authority, some sort of scientific authority. Do you personally see it as a creation of a strict hierarchy, some sort of totalitarian or authoritarian construct, or is there any place for agency here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, so in practice, the Azhar manhaj as a concept is deeply tied, I think, to a very strict kind of hierarchy and is also tied to sort of an authoritarian political project. Yet it's also not only that. So, I mean, so on the one hand, right, this is you receive knowledge from a qualified sheikh who, that means, an Azhari who has studied according to this methods. So, yes, there's a very significant emphasis on the hierarchy of knowledge transmission. It's also an approach that, as I mentioned before, is implicitly sort of polemical against Islamist and Salafi approaches. So, I mean, in certain places, Usama al-Azhari has been very direct that the Azhar manhaj is there to sort of refute the Muslim Brotherhood approach, basically. So this is a very polemical kind of discourse. It posits a notion of an Azhari that excludes these other kinds of trends, even though we know in reality that al-Azhar is actually a very diverse institution when it comes to the university and school system. Many different kinds of people are contained in al-Azhar and represented there, but not so in this concept of the Azhar manhaj. And then to Alisa's question, Usama al-Azhari is articulating this idea of the Azhar manhaj and this hierarchical notion of knowledge transmission as part of, a state project of, sort of disseminating a state interpretation of Islam or a state-condoned interpretation of Islam, but then also countering oppositional movements like that of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, yes, there is something you could say very hierarchical. There is a connection to authoritarianism here. And yet, the Azhar manhaj, I think, is not only should not only be understood in those terms, because this concept, I think, also has salience to those who do take more oppositional political stances. So, for instance, one thing I describe in my work is the a proliferation, I mean, that may even be a bit of an exaggeration, but new kinds of nonprofit institutions that teach Islamic knowledge, such as Anas al-Sultan's Sheikh al-Amud, which is a nonprofit educational institution based on the Azhar manhaj and this sort of idea of al-Azhar that is similar and I think an offshoot of what Usama al-Azhari and Ali Goma are promoting, but one where he himself participated in the 2011 Egyptian revolution, and for him the true Azhari is someone who stands up for justice and against oppression. So his political stances are different than some of these higher up ulama, even though he also subscribes to this notion of the Azhar manhaj. So, I mean, as you said before, concepts are in the air, right? So there's this articulation and this idea, and then it gets mobilized for these different kinds of political projects.
This is highly interesting because I keep thinking about there are so many words in Arabic and also about broader Muslim vocabulary throughout history to talk about a path. I mean, Sharia means a path to water, in its most basic sense. Then there is tariqa, used by Sufi orders for a long time, and it's still today to talk about, again, their own path. And, I mean, manhaj, in my own experience working on Ottoman and Turkish texts, I very rarely saw manhaj, but somehow in Turkish parlance, the usul, the concept usul, which is again Arabic and means principles, foundations, I realized usul took on this kind of, again, a sense of methodology, a path, a way to knowledge that needs to be taken into account, adhered, and revered. So then why manhaj here, and why is it in the air, let's say? I mean, once we accept that it's in the air, it must be solving a problem for all these people. So what is at stake here with manhaj? What is it against? What is it trying to differentiate? With what kind of other ways and methods and procedures it is trying to distance itself from or mark its territory?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I'm curious, Alisa, if manhaj comes up in Persian or...
Well, of course, for Iran, it is usul, which is at the center of attention. There was this theological school of Akhbaris who can be, to a certain extent, compared to the Salafis who wanted to democratize knowledge and go to the root and refute the authority of the ulama. But the Usuli school, the pro-ulama school, pro-mujtahid school, gained the upper hand, and finally they dominated the religious landscape in Iran since the end of the 18th century.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, so I think that, why did manhaj sort of rise to prominence? I'm sure there's many ways you could answer that question, and yet it's also a question that probably can't really be answered, right? These things sort of happen, they take on their own sort of life. But I do think, yes, there is, I think that the sort of the history of manhaj and one aspect of its dominance as a concept today is really the influence of European methodologies, right? Like the word method, my understanding is that this word in English and methodology is fairly recent, actually. I think I looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and I think it was, I want to say the 19th century or something, as part of sort of this emphasis on like historicism and empiricism. Method has its own kind of history, right? It became a key concept itself due to the rise of certain kinds of, epistemologies and approaches to knowledge, et cetera, in European contexts. And then I think in early 20th century Egypt, it's sort of related to, the influence of European Orientalists who were teaching at places, at least in Egypt, at Cairo University, and the kinds of language they were using. I think that is at least part of why manhaj entered the vocabulary in the way they did, or took on this kind of meaning of method or methodology. And I know Yoav de Capua in his beautiful book, I think it's called Gatekeepers of History. Would you guys remember what it's called? You can look it up. But he talks about, I think it's like the 1930s or 40s, where for Egyptian historians, manhaj became a really important concept through which these Egyptian historians were sort of able to claim parity, if you will, with their European counterparts. So manhaj, it's an Arabic term, but it became sort of part of their professionalism, if you will. So again, it relates to this specific history of European influence, actually, but then not only that, right? It takes on its own life in these later kinds of anti-colonial and then Islamist and Salafi discourses. So, but of course, you're right, that there are all of these alternative, almost equivalents that could have been chosen. And, and my sense, I'll just say, of Ali Guma is he's someone who does adopt a lot of jargon, if you will, from sort of like social sciences, humanities, right? So in a way, I think it's not a coincidence that they have decided to write in terms of manhaj, right? Because I think part of what they're doing is claiming this kind of academic authority, right, for the Islamic tradition, for the Turath and their interpretation of it, I guess. So I think it's, by writing in terms of manhaj, there's sort of this claim to scientific, scientific, or I don't know.
I think that makes sense because, especially in the modern context or modern situation, of course, paths inevitably increase. I mean, this is not just a question for the Orient. Of course, it's the same in the Occident. The multiplicity, overabundance of paths, and it makes sense. It stands to reason that a religious scholar, a member of the ulama, chooses a rather more neutral, or rather a concept that represents a certain notion of objectivity with vis-a-vis concepts like tariqa or usul maybe. But thank you.
Well, also maybe it also speaks to who he's trying to appeal to, right? So maybe he's trying to win over on some level students in social sciences, humanities, or hard sciences who may or may not be sort of interested in a tariqa or something like that. But, the idea that Islam has manhaj to offer, like on par with, European whatever, like European social sciences and humanities, I think that, that's a very, I think that could be very appealing and motivating. So, yeah, perhaps that's also why.
So is this idea of manhaj only relates to reading texts and interpreting texts? Or is it a way to live your life? For example, if I become a student at al-Azhar and I want to learn al-Manhaj, should I change my life? Should I change my attitude to time and space and God and myself in a certain way? Or is it just the way you behave in the classroom and the way you produce knowledge?
Thank you for that wonderful question. So I think the first tenet of the Azhar manhaj, as I described it, is sort of key here, where this is knowledge that is obtained through mulazama or sohba, so this experience of spending time with a sheikh and observing his adab, like his behaviors, his etiquette, the way he engages with other people, not only how he reads texts and understands them. So I think implicit in this approach, certainly is this idea of personal ethical transformation. I think that's certainly contained implicitly in the notion of manhaj. And I mean, and so on the one hand, there's this specific kind of articulation of manhaj in some texts, right? Like what Usama al-Azhari says, the Azhar manhajes. And then there's, on the other hand, sort of the way the manhaj is actually practiced at al-Azhar in the study circles, which is something that I write about in my book project, where even though, for instance, time is not specifically described in Usama al-Azhari's 8 points, for many of the students and teachers that I met during my fieldwork, there was a sense that studying according to the manhaj is studying according to sort of different rhythms of life than what you would find in Al-Azhar University, where the education has been reformed and is sort of more along the lines of what you find in Cairo University, where the year is divided into semesters and there's courses that meet at certain times for short periods, like 50 minutes or whatever the time is. And many of the students that I spoke to and some of the ulama as well, there's a sense that this kind of modern approach is not really conducive to studying the Turath. You can't really understand a hashia or a metan if you study in this kind of fragmented, limited time, which I think many people see as like an imposition from the outside. It's not sort of authentic to their tradition. It doesn't really make sense when you're trying to understand Turath. So part of what studying Turath at al-Azhar, according to this Azhar manhaj, means for people is studying. I mean, Sheikh Amr, one of the people who figures in my work, he describes this as studying above time. So not studying limited by the strictures of the school calendar, but studying a text as long as it needs to be studied, without worry for sort of money or efficiency or these sort of more material goals. So I think that too is implicit in the Azhar manhaj. There's kind of an alternate way of being, of relating to time in the manhaj as well.
So basically, manhaj appears to be, from what you are narrating, a kind of almost post-material and even maybe, to put it provocatively, even a postmodern search for an authentic path to a knowledge that is considered lost and needs to be recovered, of course, with a particular twist here. Would you agree, or do you think I'm overinterpreting?
Yeah, I think that there's the manhaj is sort of, it's the bridge, if you will, that and we could say that in a way the manhaj, it's almost equivalent to the ulama. Like that's almost what these ulama are saying. So they want to posit themselves as the bridge between contemporary Muslims who may or may not be able to read the texts texts of Turath, texts that were authored before the 20th century, where, there's terms and references that are hard for contemporary students to understand, and that these particular terms and references and the form of these texts, all of this is part of a way of being. They're not just texts. They represent sort of a way of being and a paradigm, an ethical and intellectual paradigm that existed, according to these scholars, like prior to sort of Western hegemony in Egypt. That's their specific focus. So yes, it is a way of being that is lost. And by resuscitating this manhaj in the present, you're resuscitating essentially the role of al-Azhar and its ulama, acting as, the bridge, the only bridge that can connect contemporary Muslims to their rich heritage, which can offer solutions to the problems that they currently face. I mean, that's part of what these Azhari scholars are saying. They're like, here we have our society. We have all these versions of extremism. That's the word that they use a lot, echoing the Egyptian state, but, of both secular and religious varieties. And, how can we live authentically as Muslims in this world? Returning to the Turath is the way to figure out how to do it, and the way to return to Turath is through the Manhaj.
Well, I found your research fascinating, and the most fascinating part of your research to me is the interviews you conducted with these students at al-Azhar. And there you can find people from all over the world, from Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East. So to me, this middle way, as some of your interviewees refer to it and some of the Al-Azhar scholars refer to it, overlaps a little bit with the idea of the middle way as a third world ideology, neither East nor West, neither communism nor capitalism. And it seems to me that if you look at the geography of where students come from, there is another overlap, the overlap with the geography of the third world. So do you think that it is also a means, a tool to project Egyptian influence all over the world, some sort of political authority, an alternative world model, multipolarity?
Provocative question. I mean, I think that it's a tool to promote the authority of al-Azhar. And to the extent that al-Azhar is sort of seen as an extension of Egypt, yes and no. I mean, I think in a way al-Azhar is sort of sometimes used by the state as an ambassador of Egyptian influence, even though the Sheikh al-Azhar also, I think, wants to assert himself as just his Azhar influence that even rivals that of the Egyptian president. So I definitely see it as part of al-Azhar claiming a kind of centrality, and relevance to these Muslim populations dispersed all over the world. I mean, including in the West, not just in the global South. Because students come from al-Azhar also from, Western countries as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about sort of the implicit power relationships that underlie, this kind of articulation. But, yeah, I think my first reaction is I think it's really a mode to promote al-Azhar and its scholars even more than sort of Egyptian nationalism. I don't really see that so much as part of it, even though the Egyptian nation and the sort of future and stability of the Egyptian nation is very much at the forefront of these Azhari scholars and part of their argument against democracy, against, certainly against Morsi.
To conclude, could you briefly describe one of those study circles and what they do so that, our audience can maybe visualize in their minds, at least put a face to this manhaj in a more practical fashion?
Yeah, that's a nice offering. Thank you. So when I first started attending the study circles, it was right after the Egyptian Revolution, and I attended circles in subjects related to Islamic jurisprudence with someone named Sheikh Amr al-Bordani, who at the time and still is, I think, an employee at Dar al-Ifta, and also a close disciple of Ali Goma. And so these circles that Sheikh Amr offered took place early in the morning, I think, around 7 or 8, and they took place in one of the old arwaqa in al-Azhar. So the ruwaq is the singular, arwaqa is the plural, which in English is often translated or as hostel or lodja. These were parts of al-Azhar that served both as sort of dorms for students coming from different parts of the world and different parts of Egypt, as well as the location of their classes. Today they don't serve as dorms. There's a whole sort of separate area in Cairo that serves that function today, but part of the revived study circles was bringing lessons back to the old arwaqa in the mosque. So anyway, in these classes, Sheikh Amr would usually be sitting sort of on a low chair in the front of the classroom. The women would sit often more to the back of the classroom, the men sort of closer to the front. And in these classes, Sheikh Amr would arrive, everyone would stand up, some people would, go to kiss his hand, that kind of thing. And he would, after an opening prayer, would, open the text, whatever it was, and sort of begin reading the text, word for word, and then offering his own sort of commentary, interpretation, sometimes, asking students, what kind of lam is this, like sort of particular kinds of grammatical questions, sometimes writing on the whiteboard. But basically, this is an approach of reading the text out loud, word for word, with great attention placed on each utterance of the text, and trying to make it understandable for these students. And so the students, they came from sort of different stripes, if you will. So many were foreign students at al-Azhar, many of whom were from Indonesia and Malaysia in particular, but not only that. And then there were also Egyptians, some of whom were at al-Azhar. And amongst the women that I spent time with, many tended to be sort of middle-class professionals who did not have a background at al-Azhar or in the Arabic or Islamic sciences. So people who were engineers or had studied medicine, but who I think were particularly drawn to Sheikh Amr's Sufism, and also drawn to this promise of being connected to an authentic heritage, right? It didn't matter that they didn't want to become fuqaha, even though the language, the text that he was teaching was highly specialized. Like many of the texts that he taught would not have been taught to beginning students at al-Azhar. They were actually, some of them were highly specialized for people who were really like going to become jurists. And yet he's teaching these to a public that some have background, some don't. It's free and open to the public, these classes. And so, I think for some people, it's really like being in this context, in the presence of the sheikh, having a chance to connect with this heritage through the sheikh, that makes these classes appealing. And then this promise, of, ethical transformation, I think, through that experience. That was my impression of it.
Thanks a lot, Mary. This was really fascinating, and we are really looking forward to seeing your book in print and reading more about this. You can check the notes for certain literature and sources that you could learn about these concepts, and stay tuned for other episodes.
Thank you for being with us. See you soon.